12-year-old boy, disregarded for his race, risks everything to save a child from a speeding car. This moment of heroism becomes a turning point, not just for one life, but for an entire community. Malik had spent his entire life being judged before he ever had the chance to speak. In his neighborhood, people didn't see him for who he was. They saw the color of his skin, the clothes he wore, and the quiet way he kept to himself. Assumptions followed him wherever he went, whispered in glances and unspoken in closed doors. He had learned to ignore it, to walk past the distrust, to expect nothing more than suspicion. That afternoon was no different. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement as Malik walked home from school. The streets were alive with their usual rhythm, cars idling at stop signs, children laughing as they played, and parents gathered in quiet conversation. It was an ordinary day, one that should have passed without incident. Malik walked with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't in a rush. There was nothing waiting for him at home except silence and another night of uncertainty. As he stepped past the neighborhood park, he glanced around, taking in the sight of kids playing tag, chasing each other across the grass without a care in the world. For a brief second, he let himself remember what it felt like to be that carefree. Then he heard it, a quick patter of feet, the distinct sound of sneakers pounding against pavement. A small boy, no older than 6, came rushing into view, his arms pumping as he ran with reckless abandon. His blond hair bounced with every step, his laughter ringing through the air, unbothered and free. Malik recognized him as one of the kids who lived in the houses on the next block, though they had never spoken. The boy's excitement was infectious, but Malik's smile faded as he noticed something else. Just beyond the boy, a car was coming. Fast. His stomach dropped. The driver, distracted by something inside the vehicle, hadn't noticed the child. The boy, caught up in his own world, hadn't noticed the car. But Malik saw it all. The way the boy's little feet barely touched the ground. The way the car's headlights reflected off the pavement. The way time seemed to slow as the moment unraveled before him. There was no hesitation. Malik's backpack slipped from his shoulder as he lunged forward. His legs burned as he sprinted, every step fueled by nothing but instinct. The boy, still laughing, had no idea of the danger he was in. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance, his breath sharp and shallow. The car wasn't slowing down. A rush of adrenaline shot through Malik's veins as he reached the boy. In one swift motion, he grabbed the child's arm and yanked him back just as the car sped past, its tires screeching against the asphalt. A gust of wind brushed against his skin, the force of the car's speed sending chills down his spine. They tumbled onto the sidewalk, Malik landing hard on his side while the boy let out a startled yelp. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the car disappearing down the road, its driver never realizing the tragedy they had almost caused. Malik lay there, his breath coming in quick bursts, his mind still processing what had just happened. The boy, shaken but unharmed, looked up at him with wide, confused eyes. Malik didn't care about the pain in his elbow, or the way his pulse still thundered in his ears. The only thing that mattered was that the boy was safe. Malik had spent his entire life feeling invisible. It wasn't just the way people looked at him, it was the way they didn't. He had learned early on that in a world where appearances mattered, his didn't work in his favor. His worn-out clothes, scuffed sneakers, and the way he carried himself through the city streets made him an easy target for judgment. People passed him without a second glance, or worse, with wary eyes that expected the worst before he ever had the chance to prove himself. His neighborhood was a place where opportunities were handed out based on perception. The kids who wore neatly pressed shirts and shoes that never touched the pavement without being wiped clean were the ones who got smiles, attention, and safety. Malik had none of those things. His clothes, though clean, were faded and stretched from too many years of wear. His shoes had seen miles of walking because bus fares weren't always an option. And his quiet nature wasn't a choice. It was survival. He knew that if he wanted to stay out of trouble, the best thing he could do was keep his head down and his voice lower. The young boy he had saved that day was the kind of child who never had to worry about those things. Malik had seen him before, playing outside his family's townhouse, his laughter bouncing off the walls of a life Malik couldn't imagine. The boy was always surrounded by people. His parents, his neighbors, the kind of folks who smiled at each other in the mornings and greeted the mailman by name. He was dressed in spotless, well-fitted clothes, and his world seemed effortless, untouched by struggle or suspicion. It wasn't just wealth that separated them, it was something deeper. Malik had long understood that people like the boy would grow up knowing protection, while people like him would always be questioned. He had seen it too many times to ignore. He knew what it meant when store clerks watched him more closely than other customers. He knew what it meant when doors locked a second too soon when he walked past. And he knew what it meant when no one expected someone like him to be a hero. But none of that mattered in the moment when Malik saw the boy running into the street. There was no hesitation, no time to think about how the world saw him. There was only instinct. His legs moved before his mind could process, his heart hammering as he raced to pull the child out of danger. In those few seconds, Malik wasn't thinking about his own life or the consequences that might follow. He wasn't worried about whether people would assume the worst. He only saw a child who needed help, and he acted. That was who he was, who he had always been, even if no one ever bothered to see it. But as he sat on the sidewalk, catching his breath with the boy trembling beside him, he knew the story wouldn't be as simple as a life saved. The onlookers who had witnessed the scene weren't looking at him with gratitude or admiration. Their expressions weren't filled with relief. Instead, there was hesitation, suspicion, as if they were trying to figure out if he was a hero or a threat. Malik had always known that his actions would be judged differently. A white boy saving another child would be a heartwarming moment, a picture-perfect scene that parents would proudly share. But a black boy in worn-out clothes, sitting beside a frightened white child, was something else entirely. He could already feel it in the way people hesitated, their eyes darting from him to the child, as if trying to piece together a story they weren't sure they wanted to believe. The divide between them had never felt clearer. Still, Malik knew one thing for certain. He had done the right thing. And even if the world refused to see him for who he truly was, he wouldn't change. He didn't need recognition, applause, or validation. He only needed to be himself. Because when it came down to it, when life and death were at stake, Malik had been the one to step forward. Not because he wanted to be noticed, but because it was the right thing to do. And that was something no amount of prejudice could take away from him. Malik had no time to think, only to act. The sound of screeching tires filled the air, the metallic roar of an engine barreling forward at a speed too dangerous for a crowded street. His eyes locked onto the small boy, frozen in the middle of the road, oblivious to the disaster rushing toward him. Without hesitation, Malik bolted forward, his feet pounding against the pavement. "Stop, kid!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. But the boy didn't hear him, or maybe he was too frightened to move. Malik didn't wait to find out. He lunged, grabbing the boy by the shoulders and yanking him backward with all his strength. The child stumbled into his arms just as the car sped past, missing them by inches. The rush of air from the vehicle sent a chill down Malik's spine. The blare of the car horn echoed down the street, fading into the distance, as the driver, either unaware or unwilling to stop, disappeared from sight. For a moment, everything was silent. The boy trembled in Malik's grip, wide-eyed and breathless. Malik could feel his own heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. Slowly, he loosened his hold, making sure the kid was steady on his feet. "You okay?" Malik asked, his voice softer now, no longer filled with urgency. The boy nodded, his small hands still gripping Malik's shirt like a lifeline. He was too shaken to speak. Then came the murmurs. The bystanders, who had been frozen in place just moments ago, were beginning to react. Some were whispering, exchanging glances. A few rushed forward to check on the boy, but none of them immediately acknowledged Malik. He could feel their hesitation. It wasn't relief or gratitude in their eyes. It was something else, something colder. He wasn't just the boy who had saved a child. He was a black boy, dressed in second-hand clothes, standing beside a scared white child in the middle of the street. And for some, that alone was enough to make them question what had just happened. A woman gasped, rushing forward to scoop the boy into her arms. She held him tightly, running her hands over his face as if checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. The boy shook his head. Only then did the woman glance at Malik, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "What happened?" she demanded, her eyes scanning him, as if trying to figure out why he had been so close to the child in the first place. Malik took a step back, his stomach twisting. "He ran into the street," he explained, his voice measured. "I pulled him back before the car hit him." A few others in the crowd nodded, murmuring about how fast the car had been going, how lucky the boy was. But even as they spoke, Malik could feel the way their gazes lingered on him, how some still hesitated to acknowledge what had happened. The weight of their assumptions hung in the air. Malik clenched his jaw, resisting the frustration bubbling in his chest. He had done something good. He had saved a life. And yet the doubt in their eyes reminded him that, to them, he would always be a question mark, a boy whose actions required extra explanation, extra justification. The child, still clinging to his mother's side, finally found his voice. "He saved me," the boy said, his words quiet but firm. "He pulled me back." The woman's eyes flickered with something, maybe realization, maybe guilt. She exhaled, tightening her grip on her son. "Thank you," she said, but there was hesitation in her tone, as if the words felt foreign on her tongue. Malik didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his gaze steady, refusing to shrink under the weight of their scrutiny. Because no matter what they thought, no matter what assumptions they had made, the truth was clear. He had saved that boy's life. And nothing, not their doubt, their hesitation, or their prejudice, could change that. The boy's father arrived moments later, his boots slamming against the pavement as he pushed through the crowd. His face, flushed from a mix of panic and exertion, hardened the moment his eyes locked onto Malik. His son stood just a few feet away, still shaken, but very much alive. And next to him, too close in the man's eyes, stood the boy who had saved him. Malik could feel the weight of the father's gaze before the man even spoke. It wasn't relief or gratitude that filled his expression at first. It was something else, something colder, something that had been ingrained in him long before this moment. "Who is this?" the father demanded, his voice sharp as he pulled his son into his arms. His grip on the boy was protective, almost possessive, as if shielding him from an unseen threat. The boy, still breathless, turned to his father and spoke the words that shattered the weight of the man's assumptions. "He saved me, Dad," the boy whispered. "I almost got hit. He pulled me back." The father's body stiffened, his eyes narrowing as if struggling to process the reality of what he had just heard. His gaze flickered back to Malik, searching for something, doubt, a reason not to believe his own son. But the truth was undeniable. The bystanders nodded in agreement, murmuring about how the car had come out of nowhere, how Malik had thrown himself forward without hesitation. Malik didn't say anything. He didn't expect anything. He had done what was right, not for recognition, but because it was the only thing to do. Yet now, standing in front of this man who had likely spent years seeing people like Malik as something less, he couldn't help but wonder if this moment would change anything. The father's expression was unreadable, but something in his stance shifted. His grip on his son loosened slightly, his breath no longer ragged from panic. The lines on his face, once set in rigid judgment, wavered just enough to let something else creep in. Discomfort. Not at Malik himself, but at the realization of what had just happened. Malik watched as the man swallowed hard, glancing around at the watching crowd before clearing his throat. "You!" He hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. It was as if the words themselves were difficult to form. "You saved my son." Malik nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. The father's jaw clenched, his mind no doubt warring with years of ingrained prejudice. He had spent a lifetime teaching his son to be careful, to be wary of people like Malik. And yet, when his son's life had truly been in danger, it wasn't someone who looked like him who had come to the rescue. It was the boy he would have crossed the street to avoid. The silence stretched. The air between them felt heavy, with everything that had gone unspoken for years. Assumptions, judgments, quiet moments of avoidance, the invisible walls that divided communities. Then finally, the father took a deep breath and stepped forward. He stopped, shaking his head slightly before trying again. "I was wrong." His voice was quieter now, raw. "I've been wrong about a lot of things." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, others looked down, uncomfortable with the honesty of the moment. Malik held the man's gaze, searching for insincerity but finding none. The father swallowed his pride, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said, his words careful but genuine, "for saving my son." Malik looked down at the outstretched hand. A part of him wanted to walk away, to let the man sit with the weight of his guilt without granting him an easy out. But Malik wasn't built that way. He wasn't someone who let bitterness take root in his heart. So, after a brief hesitation, he shook the man's hand. The crowd exhaled as if releasing a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a grand speech about change or a sweeping transformation of deeply held beliefs. But it was a crack in the foundation of something old and broken, a shift in a story that had always seemed set in stone. And sometimes that was enough to start something new. Word of Malik's heroism spread quickly. What had started as a tense moment on the street soon became a story retold in homes, schools, and community centers. At first, it was just murmurs, small conversations about what had happened, people wrestling with the weight of what they had witnessed. But then, something more tangible took shape. Local organizations, often indifferent to kids like Malik, suddenly took notice. His name, once overlooked, now carried significance. The first offer came from a mentoring program, one designed to uplift young people who had the potential but not the resources to thrive. An invitation arrived in the form of a handwritten letter, delivered to the shelter where Malik and his mother were staying. It was from a community leader who had heard what he had done and wanted to help him build a future beyond the labels that had been placed on him for so long. A few days later, the news reached a small foundation that provided scholarships for underprivileged youth. They reached out to Malik's school, one of the few places where he was simply seen as another student, rather than a boy with a troubled background. The foundation offered him a scholarship, ensuring that his education would no longer be another obstacle in his life. For the first time, Malik saw doors opening that he never thought existed. At first, he didn't know how to react. Opportunities like these weren't meant for kids like him. At least, that was what he had been taught to believe. But as more people came forward wanting to support him, wanting to hear his story, Malik began to realize that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't some fleeting moment of recognition. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger. The father of the boy he had saved played his own part in this change. Though his transformation wasn't immediate, it was real. He didn't try to paint himself as a hero for apologizing, nor did he pretend that one incident had erased all the biases he had carried for years. But he did something that mattered. He started speaking up. In conversations where people whispered judgments about kids like Malik, he corrected them. When someone dismissed Malik's actions as luck, he made sure they understood that what the boy had done was an act of undeniable courage. And most importantly, he made sure his son knew the truth, that bravery, kindness, and humanity weren't defined by race or status. Malik's mother watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. She had always known her son was remarkable, even when the world refused to see it. Now, for the first time, she wasn't the only one who recognized his worth. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear that the world would never give him a fair chance, began to lighten. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood itself started to shift, if only slightly. Conversations changed. Perspectives widened. People who had spent years ignoring the struggles of kids like Malik now saw them in a different light. Not everyone changed overnight. Prejudice was not so easily erased. But the cracks had formed in a foundation that had once seemed unbreakable. Malik, however, didn't let the attention change who he was. He remained the same kid, curious, determined, and full of a quiet strength that had always been there. But now he walked with a little more confidence. He no longer felt invisible. One evening, as he sat on the steps of his building, watching the city move around him, he let himself think about the future. For so long, it had been a distant, unreachable thing, shaped by limitations and assumptions. But now, it felt different. It felt like something he could reach out and grasp. For the first time in his life, Malik allowed himself to believe that his story wasn't just about survival. It was about possibility. Malik had never thought of himself as a hero. He had simply acted in the moment, doing what felt right. But now, standing in the same neighborhood that had once dismissed him, he saw the undeniable shift. People who had previously looked past him now acknowledged him. Some nodded in respect. Others stopped to talk, their voices carrying a newfound warmth. It was a quiet change, but a powerful one. The white boy's family remained forever grateful. His father, once entrenched in his own biases, had begun to see the world differently. Though he had spent years believing harmful stereotypes, Malik's actions had forced him to confront his own prejudices. He spoke of Malik's bravery whenever he could, not as a way to erase his past ignorance, but as a step toward something better. His transformation was not perfect, nor was it immediate, but it was real. The community as a whole had begun to shift, if only slightly. Conversations about race and class were no longer brushed aside. Neighbors who had once ignored the injustices happening around them now paid closer attention. Some actively worked to challenge the biases they had long held. The barriers that had divided them for so long were beginning to crack. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Malik, however, was not concerned with the attention. He didn't see himself as a symbol or a lesson. He was still just a boy, trying to navigate a world that had often been unkind to him. But now, for the first time, he saw something different, a future. The scholarships, the mentorships, the opportunities, these were things he had never dared to dream of before. And yet, they were now his reality. One evening, as he walked through the streets, he caught his reflection in a shop window. For years, he had seen himself through the eyes of others, an outsider, a kid who didn't belong. But now, as he looked at himself, he saw something else. He saw strength. He saw resilience. He saw someone who had refused to be defined by the limits others had placed on him. As he continued walking, he passed by a group of younger kids playing on the sidewalk. One of them, a boy no older than 6, looked up at him with wide eyes. "You're the kid who saved that boy, right?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and admiration. Malik hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Yeah," he said simply. The boy grinned, nodding as if committing Malik's face to memory. "That was really cool." Malik chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair before walking away. He didn't need recognition or praise. He didn't need the world to see him as a hero. It was enough to know that he had made a difference, not just in one life, but in the way people saw the world around them. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about showing that courage had no color, that kindness could break down walls, and that even in a community steeped in prejudice, one act of heroism could change everything.